Welcome to the latest installment of the Ohio Chamber of Commerce's Down to Business podcast. We have a special guest today from Nationwide Insurance, and we're here to talk about Ohio's new distracted driving law, which was recently signed by Governor DeWine at the beginning of 2023. We're excited today to have with us Beth Risco, President of Personal Lines Insurance at Nationwide Insurance. She'll be here to answer a few questions about the bill, but before we turn it over to her, figured we start with give everyone an understanding of what is in the legislation. So during the legislature's lame duck period, which just ended in December, the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, along with many other proponents, were pushing the legislature to enact distracted driving legislation here in Ohio. Unfortunately, Ohio was one of only a handful of states that had yet to pass a true distracted driving law. And that causes problems. It creates increased cost for insurance, but also makes our roads less safe. And so it's an issue that impacts everyone in our state. Senate Bill 288 was the legislation that enacted the law, which was a larger bill that included many different changes to Ohio's criminal law. But when through the legislative process, an amendment was added to incorporate House Bill 283, the original distracted driving law in Ohio. The sponsors, Representative Brian Lampton and Representative Abrams, supported the legislation and were great advocates for it. What the bill does is a couple different things, but first and foremost, it makes distracted driving a primary offense. Previous to the enactment of the law, distracted driving was only a secondary offense, so you could not be pulled over only for distracted driving. The bill also expands the definition of what is distracted driving. Previously in Ohio, only texting and driving was prohibited, so more egregious behaviors like watching videos or even performing TikToks would not qualify as distracted driving behavior. So under the legislation, Ohio law now prohibits holding or physically supporting an electronic communication device or your phone with your body. There are some limited exceptions though, including if you're holding that phone near your ear, if you're at a red light, stopped, and if you're able to use a single touch to operate that handheld device. To enforce the law, there are several fines that can be levied against a offender, and those fines do escalate if you are a repeat offender. Also, the legislation calls for education. So when young motorists or new motorists are taking their driving courses, they are now going to be taught about distracted driving and the law. And also the test that they will take will have distracted driving questions on it. Also, the legislation requires posting of signs reminding motorists of the distracted driving law near airports and near borders with other states. This legislation was important to the Ohio Chamber. It was on our top 10 priority list going into the lame duck period, and we did key vote the legislation. We were proud to see that it passed with broad bipartisan majorities and was signed into law earlier this week on January 3rd, 2023. So with me today is Beth Risco from Nationwide Insurance. She is the president of Personal Lines, and she will answer a few of the questions that I thought up for her and would like to get her perspective. So Beth, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. So glad to be here with you today.
Do you want to give a quick introduction about yourself?
Sure. So as you said, I'm Beth Risco. I run the personal lines operation at Nationwide. We're about a $9 billion personal lines writer in the U.S., so top 10 writer in the U.S., and we're passionate about this legislation. We're happy to see it passed. Congratulations to the governor and to the Ohio legislators for taking this great step forward. And the reason we're so passionate about it is our business is really all about helping to put people's lives back together following an accident. And so we see the cost, professionally, personally, physically to individuals, financially, in the event that they experience an accident because of distracted driving. So it's absolutely wonderful to see Ohio step forward, pass legislation that should make our roads safer for all of us. And as a mother with, myself on the road and my kids as well, personally, I'm really thrilled and want to say thank you to everybody who helped to get this law in place.
Absolutely. So let's get into the interview.
Hmm.
So now that distracted driving legislation has been enacted in Ohio, how will motorists be impacted?
So I think the key here is this law really does set a standard for the right behavior, for the expected behavior on the road. And I think that's critical. Maybe I can take a step back and say, our studies have shown through data that we've been able to glean with customers who are willing to share their data, so voluntarily sharing data with us on their driving behavior, we know that most people on the road on a regular basis are distracted. And so when you think about it, this law really helps to create, I think, first and foremost, awareness, and then secondarily accountability for driving safe on the road. And I said we know that from our own studies that people do drive distracted. Just to give you a sense of what that means, we know that in a typical drive, 20-minute drive, people are distracted about 13 times, and those distractions last about 6 seconds. So if you think about the typical speed that you're driving in your car, that means about 13 times in a typical drive, you are not paying attention to the road for the length of a football field. And so we have these major blind spots regularly when we're driving on the road. I think the key to this law is it's about, again, back to that point about creating awareness of the dangers and also creating accountability. If you're going to behave in dangerous ways, we need to hold you accountable before you create damage to yourself or, frankly, those around you.
That figure that you're distracted 13 times in a 20-minute drive is frightening, considering that's basically every other minute there's something pulling your attention away from the road, and highlights, again, the importance of this legislation.
Absolutely.
To kind of piggyback on that, so why do we think states should make distracted driving a primary offense rather than a kind of a secondary violation?
I think the data speaks for itself. So there was a 2018 study that we did that showed that states that had enacted legislation similar to this one actually experienced a 15% decrease in auto crash related fatalities 2 years following the enactment of the law. 6 states in that same analysis saw a decrease in 20% in fatality rates. And that's really the key, right? This law is about really the importance. When you make it a primary offense, you create increased accountability. You have the opportunity, number one, I think, to educate folks who are driving distracted, but you're holding them accountable. And our data shows that when you do that, you see a reduction in dangerous behavior on the road and in fatalities, which really that's what it's all about, right? It's about making the road safer for all of us. Nationwide's been a big proponent in every state for primary enforcement. We think because of this data, it's shown and proven that it's a really valuable tool to use among the many tools that we have to increase driver safety. And, I think the other thing that's really important, and you alluded to this, Ohio was one of the few states that didn't have a law like this in place. So it's certainly become, I think, a trend across the U.S. where there's been awareness in legislatures of the dangers of distracted driving. And, frankly, as a proud Ohioan myself, I don't want us to be the last state to enact a law that's really about driving safety on the roads, no pun intended. And so I think it's great to see our legislators stepping forward and really finding a way to create a law that works effectively to create safer roads for all of us. You also mentioned, I think this is important, this isn't just about texting and driving, and you mentioned it, right? So there are a lot of other ways in which we're all distracted. And when I say we all, look, I'm prone to this myself as well. Games, people are watching videos while they're on the road. This law really, I think, does a better job defining for us what safe and unsafe really means when it comes to the handheld devices we have now. So I think, making this a primary offense gives us the opportunity to really make sure that we're out there getting those offenders and making sure that we're holding them accountable. And the fact that it's expanded the definition of what counts as an offense is really critical for making sure that we're thinking about the many ways in which we can make the road safe and manage unsafe behavior.
I think it's clear from the way the legislation is drafted, this is a comprehensive approach, not just talking about cell phones, but these, handheld electronic communication devices, and trying to project towards the future, what is distracted driving in the future going to look like. And the goal was to hopefully not have to come back to the legislature to update the law based upon the changes in technology. So that, I think, was a great part of the bill. My next question I have for you is, how do we address this culture of distracted driving? We discussed it a little bit, but we see data shows that younger Americans are more likely to be distracted and maybe even less likely to think it's dangerous behavior. So how do we get to the root cause or try and stop that culture of distracted driving?
Boy, that's the big question, isn't it? And I don't think we figured out yet all the answers. I think there's lots of things we need to do. This law is one. But education is another. And, I was thinking about it over the holidays. I was out on the roads, and in Ohio this year for sure, we had some challenging driving conditions. And I was driving on a road the other day and snow covered, and somebody passed me, and I thought, I wonder if there's sort of a lack as our cars have become safer. As I think about what cars were like when I was growing up versus what they are now, I wonder if one of the impacts of that is we've come to believe they're perfectly safe. And so, for me, the thought I had as I was driving down the road, passed on a snowy road by somebody going very fast, is, have we lost the perspective that we're driving a really large, powerful machine? And do we really wrap into our heads what that means? The data would tell us probably not. And our studies show that about 2/3 of people we've surveyed will admit that having a device in your hand, whether it's to talk or to text or use an app, they will identify that as something that they consider to be dangerous. So we all sort of cerebrally know it. And yet here's the interesting statistic. Over half of those surveyed admit that they've done that. And they've done it in the past 6 months. So it's not, just a historical behavior. I think that's part of the challenge, frankly, collectively we have, is helping us build the discipline in our driving behavior, that we drive in a way that acknowledges the fears we have about those around us on the road. And yet maybe I think we all tend to overestimate our ability to manage distracted behavior. I don't have an answer, but I think continuing to get the message out there is just really critical for all of us. It's life or death, and it matters.
And Nationwide's been a leader on distracted driving legislation, not just in Ohio, but nationwide, if you will. And part of that was a survey that you guys put out that found that nearly 90% of Americans support hands-free legislation. And so could you just talk more about that survey and your findings?
Absolutely. So we did a survey, and what we found, we did the survey last year, and what we found was that drivers are overwhelmingly supportive of hands-free legislation. So you mentioned it. It's 88% of consumers say they support legislation to address distracted driving. I really think this gets back to the fact that for all of us on the roads, who hasn't had the experience of seeing somebody maybe weaving in and out of a lane and you look over and they're holding a phone? So I think there's certainly a desire out there to make the roads safer. Survey also showed that 86% support legislation in their state that would prohibit drivers from holding their phones while talking or texting or for other purposes except for emergency. So we know there's a desire out there for safer roads. I think, this legislation certainly puts Ohio on the map as one of the states that's advancing its rules in that space. I do think it's interesting. I think that, when you look at it, some states don't have hands-free laws on the books, and most drivers think their states already have them. So there's also a little bit of a disconnect with what consumers believe about their state laws compared to what they've got. But at the same time, even though they think their state may have already passed a law, they also, back to that point again, they will also admit they're still using handheld devices in their cars. So there's the continued opportunity for us to get our behavior to align with our perspective on what our behavior should be.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my daily life, I've known people to think there was a distracted driving law in Ohio, and when you explain to them there isn't one, and they look shocked and confused. And also, in Ohio, we do have home rule authority, so certain cities, municipalities had their own laws, which made it confusing to drivers. And there's another benefit of having this legislation enacted, because now we have one uniform, consistent law across the state wherever you're traveling. So my final question for you is to maybe harken back to the pandemic, if you will. The pandemic changed a lot for a lot of people, and the roadways were no exception. You see and feel maybe people are traveling faster, and I think there's a recent survey that proves that people do believe the roads are more dangerous after the pandemic. So are you able to elaborate on that
Absolutely.
a little bit?
Yeah, so the National Highway Traffic Safety Association, that's a mouthful, did a survey, and what they found was, compared to 2020, so if we look at behavior sort of in the pandemic compared to what we saw in 2020, 81% think drivers are more aggressive, 79% think drivers are driving faster, 76% of those surveyed thought drivers were more reckless. And I think what's even more frightening than that is a full 34%, so a little over a third of drivers still believe it's safe to hold the phone while driving. It's back to that same concept of it's not me, it's everybody around me. Our data would show that during the pandemic, I think when the roads especially were very empty, we did see reckless driving. We saw speeds increase. I mean, there were roads that were, they could become racetracks at the time. And, the data certainly supports the theory so far that our behavior has not completely reverted back to pre-pandemic levels. And I don't know what your experience is, but mine certainly is, and I made the drive up here from the Cincinnati area up to Columbus yesterday. I still feel like there's more reckless, more aggressive drivers on the road now than what we had pre-pandemic.
Yeah, I think anyone who's traveled on 71 or 70, I think, shares that experience. And it seems to be a national phenomenon, with 80% of folks thinking drivers are more dangerous. And in the political world, 80% is blue sky territory. Those are numbers that no issue can get to, or especially no politician can reach. So it just is amazing that, near universal belief that drivers are more dangerous now than they were before the pandemic. So want to thank you, Beth, for coming in today. And to close out today's podcast, want to highlight again, this legislation will save lives, and it's been really important for the Ohio Chamber to support this legislation because of its benefit, not only on the business community, but also on the lives of people here in Ohio. So, Beth, thank you so much for your time. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this edition of the Ohio Chamber of Commerce's Down to Business podcast.